here in church just for a minute? Would that be all right? So, okay, today, when we see people kissing, it often has strong, at least in our culture, strong romantic connotations. I actually teach this class on how to read the Bible for all it's worth, and one of the things we talk about is when we read the Bible, often one of the gaps that we have to overcome is what's called an historical gap, because the culture then was very different than the culture now. And we were actually talking about this passage in 1 Corinthians. I don't know if you've read that letter before, but it's a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to this early church, and this early church was full of divisions. And they have different factions here and different factions there. There's no unity between them. And he writes this incredible letter about how they ought to love each other and get along and be unified, at the end of which he says this: greet one another with a holy kiss. And since the Bible says it, I'd like everybody to stand up on their feet, turn to the person next to you, male or female. No, okay. There's a couple men in here that were getting very uncomfortable. Bruce is moving over from Paul. So, okay, apparently the culture then is different than our culture now. And I want to talk about what a kiss meant then. Paul says, greet one another with a holy kiss. By the way, it just reminds me, when I was a missionary in Nigeria, that culture there was also very different. And you would never see, for instance, a husband and wife holding hands in public. It didn't happen. You did not hold hands with your wife. What you did find was that two men who were friends, as they were walking down the road together to express their friendship with one another, would start holding hands, which, by the way, when I would walk down the road with someone, would freak me out. But no kidding, I mean, they just grabbed my hand, and it's like we were strolling down the road, and I mean, that culture is different than this one. The biblical culture is different than the one we have today. And where holding hands in our culture has romantic overtones, where kissing in our culture has romantic overtones, it was different then. What did a kiss mean in that culture? A kiss was the ultimate public demonstration of unity and friendship. So what happened when Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, they had factions among them. They weren't unified. And so he talks about how they need to be unified and get along with each other. The hallmark passage in there is 1 Corinthians 13. You remember, it's a love passage, right? Love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, it doesn't boast, it is not rude or proud, keeps no record of wrongs. And he talks about how Christians, they ought to love each other. He gets done. He says, okay, now this is what I've told you. Greet each other with a holy kiss, which is the ultimate sign in that culture of friendship and unity. Now I want you to reflect on how Judas betrayed Jesus with a public sign of friendship and unity. It's the way of saying we're together. It was Judas's way of stabbing him in the back. And this passage starts out by saying that Jesus knew that the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus. He's sitting at the table with him. Jesus is now going to show the full extent of his love. I love the other way, so that's one way this passage gets set up. There's another way. It begins in verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. Jesus knew that he was the top dog. He was the top guy. God had put all things under his power. He was at the very top, that he had come from God and that he was returning to God. Jesus knew all these things. You think of the aspirations of these religious leaders that Jesus turns to. They want to sit in the most prominent seat. They want to be greeted in the marketplace. You know, in that culture, it was very obvious, just by the way, for instance, people dressed, about the order in society. Were you a Roman citizen or not? Were you free or were you a slave? Were you male or were you female? Were you wealthy or were you poor? Just the clothes you wore. Immediately you could look at someone and say, that person's rich, that person is a Roman citizen, that person's free, that person's a slave. And everyone, of course, just much like our culture, Their desire was to what? Rise up, sit in a better seat. It's interesting how this passage says Jesus knew that he was at the top. That God had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. And then there's this next word. I want you to underline it, put a star by it, circle it. Jesus knew he was a top guy. Verse 4 begins this way. So, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. This is interesting. I just mentioned to you that you could just look at someone and know what their standing in society was. It was common then that you wore both an inner garment and an outer garment, and the way the outer garment appeared betrayed how wealthy you were, the type of clothing that it was. A person who was of the most meager means sometimes would just wear that inner garment with a towel around their waist. They were the very lowest in society, and it's interesting. Jesus, knowing that he was a top guy, takes off that outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist. He now appears like the servant in this room. Verse 5 says, after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Maybe a little bit about washing feet. So, I suppose that if I were to call on you right now and have a water basin here and ask you to start washing everybody's feet, that would not be a pleasurable job. That is not the most exciting thing that you could possibly imagine, at least in our culture. Most of us are wearing socks and closed-toe shoes, and except for maybe some of the sock lint that would be between the toes, and the funny-shaped toes that you might have to touch, it wouldn't be that bad. But I want you to keep in mind in Jesus' day, today we have sidewalks that are very, very clean. We have roads that are very, very clean. We wear closed-toed shoes and socks. In that day, there were no paved roads. There was no paved sidewalks. No matter where you went, there were dusty trails, and you wore open-toe shoes. And so by the time you went from one place to another, your feet were very dirty. And just a little bit about, a meal like this. Often today we sit at a table and we sit at a chair and the table's about here, and so we're sitting like this. In that day, people didn't sit at tables like that. In fact, they reclined at their table. Often when you read in the Bible, it says they were reclining at the table. And that's because their tables were very low to the ground. And the way you ate is you would kind of lay, your feet would be up, your head would be down. And if you get the picture, my head would be next to someone else's what? Feet? Okay. You get it, right? So it was important that when you entered a room,